We're going to be in the Gospel of Matthew. We're looking at Matthew chapter 17, verses 22 through 27. And I hope this is a meaningful sermon to you, because it is for me. The title is A Remedy for Chaos, or The Remedy for Chaos. I hope you're going to be blessed by that. I've been blessed by getting to feed on this all week. Let's read the text first, and we'll exposit it. Starting in verse 22, as they were gathering in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day." And they were greatly distressed. I would ask you to watch for two things in the sermon. Our sermon topics are going to be witnessing atrocities, because Jesus is letting them know that an atrocity is about to happen when they get to Jerusalem. But we witness atrocities in our day, and I want to bring this into our time as well. The second thing would be, how do we triumph? What do we do in the face of atrocities? What did Jesus do? So we'll look at that. The verse that we just read is the second time, what we call the second passion narrative. This is the second time that Jesus is telling his disciples full well what's going to happen when they get to Jerusalem. The first time we saw this was in chapter 16. And if you remember, Jesus said, "I have to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to suffer. They will kill me." And at that time, Peter said, "No way, Jesus, I'm never going to let that happen to you. No way." That was the first passion narrative. Today is the second passion narrative. There's going to be three altogether. So Jesus is trying to make it very clear to his disciples what's about to happen. And Jesus has to work extra hard, it seems, to bring his disciples into God's eschatology, into God's plan, because let's remember, in that first year, that first century, there was a hardening that had come over the Jews. Isaiah chapter 6 predicted it, that it'll be a hardening that'll happen. They'll have eyes, but they won't be able to see. They'll have ears, but they won't be able to hear. And so Jesus makes it clear that he tries extra hard to reveal these things to certain ones of his disciples. This passion narrative gives us a couple new aspects of the passion narrative that we didn't see in the last one. And one of the first things he says is, "I'm going to be handed over. I'm going to be betrayed," basically. This is going to happen at the hands of somebody I consider my own friend, and yet there's also another person involved. Bad things don't just happen, but somebody else has to let them happen. So this word paradidomai, to deliver or to hand over, it can be a very severe word that means didomai is the word for gift, to give. Para is to hand over, so you're giving somebody over. So in an extreme sense, this word can be used for betraying your best friend, to betray someone. But in its weaker sense, it can be like handing a baby over to the babysitter. You're just delivering over the person. So I want to show you there are two ways that paradidomai gets used. Jesus says, "I'm about to be paradidomai, handed over to the hands of men." The first time we see this is in Romans chapter 8 and verse 32, and it speaks about God being the one who hands Jesus over. Verse 32, "He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up," paradidomai. God gave up his own son for us. How will he not also graciously give us all things? So God, number one, in order for this atrocity to happen, God had to allow it to happen. In fact, in Jesus' case, this was God's gift to the world to reconcile people back to himself. But the word also gets used in its more extreme, harsher sense, to betray somebody, and that's referring to Judas Iscariot. Matthew chapter 10 and verse 4, "And Judas Iscariot, paradidomai, betrayed Jesus." Chapter 26 and verse 48. Now, the paradidomai, the betrayer, had given them a sign, saying, the one that I will kiss is the man, so seize him. Now, in the atrocity, in the suffering, in the persecution and death of Jesus, there's a significance in that he atones for the sins of mankind. He reconciles all men back to God. But I want to deal a little bit more with the other notion of just the suffering and the atrocity. Because the things that happened to Jesus have been prevalent throughout time ever since Cain and Abel. Ever since Cain and Abel. Cain killed his brother Abel, murdered his brother Abel. There was anger, there was rage, there was hatred, there was violence in about the second or third chapter or page of our Bibles. And so I want to talk about this atrocities, anger, rage, and violence. Several stories in the Bible. Let me just give you a couple. We talked about Jacob and Esau. Coming to mind is John the Baptist, right? John the Baptist, of women, no one greater has been born than John the Baptist. It's what Jesus said. And yet, what happened to John the Baptist? Anger and rage and atrocities, violence was exhibited towards a godly man. And I would like to deal with this. How do we deal with violence and atrocity? Let me talk to you about Job first. Violence and atrocities happened to Job, but it's even more stunning when we realize that Job was a good man. Job was a righteous man who feared God and obeyed His commandments. So if anybody ever deserved a good life, a carefree, trouble-free life, it was Job. Look at how the Bible talks about him. Job chapter 1 and verse 1, there's a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. I would put squares around those very important verbs in that verse. Blameless, upright, feared God, turned from evil. What glorious descriptive verbs or adjectives? I don't know. But wonderful descriptive words about a man. We would all aspire to have those same words written about us. Blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from everything that's evil. So that's Job. We go on in verse 5, and it says, not only was Job righteous himself, but Job wanted righteousness so much that, like all parents, Job wanted to see his own kids walking in righteousness. But apparently from the text, it sounds like his kids would all get together in one of their houses and they would party down. They would party like it was AD 1999, something like that. So apparently Job was concerned about his children because they weren't fleeing from evil. And so Job would get up early in the morning, and we would call this interceding. If you're a parent, I would take note of that. He's worried about his kids that are probably acting rebellious. And so Job wakes up every morning and he intercedes to God on behalf of any wickedness that his kids might be involved in. So it says in verse 5, Job, would rise early in the morning, and he would offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all, meaning for each of his kids. For Job said, it may be that my children have sinned, and they've cursed God in their heart. And thus Job did continually, I'd put a square around that, did continually interceding for his children. Every time I think about that, guys, I am so grateful for my mother because there were probably more than a dozen years where I was probably doing what Job's children were doing, not turning away from evil. And I have absolute confidence that my mother interceded for me on a daily basis. I'll bet you might have to ask her but I would suggest it was probably longer than 20 years. 20 years of interceding for someone. And I think that the reason I'm here today is because God listened to her prayers. How do you, when someone loves the depravity that they're living in, how do you ever break those ties on that person? I don't know, but for me it happened overnight. It happened overnight. I said, I'm not doing that anymore, and I'm going back to the right way. It happened overnight. And so I'm grateful for those prayers. Otherwise, I fear what could have happened. So in Job's life, he intercedes for his kids. In Job's life, we have two scenes. The first scene doesn't affect Job himself, but it affects everything Job has. Local thugs come. They kill all of Job's employees, all of the people that were working in his business. His business has now been doxxed and he is out of business. His employees are all dead. After that, fire falls out of the sky and kills all of his animals, all of his livestock. One tragedy, one atrocity after another. Third, a local gang shows up and they kill all of his personal animals. Any of the animals that weren't killed by that fire, the few remaining ones that he probably thanked God for, these ones that are surviving, possibly his alpacas maybe, who knows what they were, but he had some animals that he loved. Then he was holding on to the ones that survived, but a local gang comes and the text says it butchered the remaining ones of his animals. Can't imagine how bloody and gory that scene must have been. And then finally, ultimately, all of his sons and daughters had gotten together. You might say they rented a beach house for the week, something like that. And a hurricane came in and destroyed the house, and all the children in it were killed. We're talking about violence. We're talking about atrocities, things that happened to a man that he didn't deserve. Finally, when that doesn't shake Job, Job says, God is good. I love God. He takes and he gives and he takes. And I'm holding on to God. Well, another stage of atrocity happens. Job himself is stricken with boils and horrible discomfort all over his body from head to toe. So he can't even go lay down and curl up in a ball and find any comfort. The man is suffering, and by the text it says, and Job never understands why bad things happen to him. He's never told, he's never explained, he never knows why. There's just violence and atrocities and rage and anger that happens in the world, and sometimes it even happens to good people. John the Baptist suffered the same thing. In Job's story, as a matter of fact, Job appeals to God. And here's an interesting part of the story. Job appeals to God and says, this isn't right. And God's answer back is, Job, who do you think you are? I control the stars. I store up the snow. I hold back the wind. I send rages on the ocean. I'm in charge of all of this. Who do you think you are, Job? And the Bible says that Job was silent from then on. The Ecclesiastes says there's no rhyme or reason. We can't figure out the violence and the rage and the atrocities. And so Job kept silent, and he loved God and worshiped God and never accused God, never blamed God. John the Baptist suffered the same thing. Jesus said that of women, there's been nobody born that is greater than John the Baptist. What happened to him? Matthew 17 and verse 12. I tell you that Elijah has already come and they didn't recognize him, but they did to him whatever they pleased. And so the Son of Man will certainly also suffer at their hands. They took the greatest man that was ever born, according to Jesus, and anger and rage and violence and atrocious things happened to John. This goes all the way back to the first pages of the Bible. Where does this come from? Why is our world like this? When we look at Genesis chapter 4 and verse 8, here's the first instance of atrocities and murder happening. Genesis 4 and verse 8, Cain spoke to Abel, his brother. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel, and he killed him. And I want to remind you that just one page earlier, God had just gotten done looking at the creation and saying, man, it's good. It's good. Genesis 1 and verse 8, Genesis 1 and 31. God saw everything that He had made. Behold, it was very good. Then there was evening and there was morning on the sixth day. What happened between God looking at His creation and saying, it is very good, and one page later, violence, hatred, anger, murder, atrocities? What happened? And in the simplest way, I want to share with you what ruined everything. What ruined everything was when men decided that they wanted God out of their way. Adam and Eve and God walked together in the garden, and they knew the rules, and God wanted to protect them. But Adam and Eve decided, I don't want God telling me what I can and cannot do. And so they pushed God out of the way, and they did what they wanted to do. And that's the source of all of the violence and rage and murder that has gone on since Cain and Abel. Everything that's going to happen to Jesus all happens because two people said, I don't want God telling me what to do. Men decided that they wanted God out of the way. It happened in the garden. It's happened all throughout the Old Testament, and it happens today. One sole woman said, I don't want God in the school system. How does one person kick God out of the schools? But it happened. I want God out of the workplace. I don't want people to be able to talk about God in the workplace. I know that my mother volunteered at a hospital, and one of the first things they told her at the hospital is you're not allowed to talk about God to the patients. Men have been filled with the same weakness that Adam and Eve have had. And today, they're trying to take God out of the church. A lot of preachers don't want to preach the true God to the world for all kinds of reasons. I'm thinking of Saul, the first king of Israel, was very blessed by God until the moment when Saul decided, I don't want God telling me what to do. God had said, destroy everything when you go into that place. Man, women, children, animals. And the prophet comes and says, how come I still hear sheep? And Saul said, I know God said kill everything, but I had a better idea. Let's keep the sheep, and then we'll offer them as sacrifices later. Let's keep all the people, and then we can use them as free labor, slave labor. Something made sense to Saul that seemed like a better idea than what God had said. It's gone on throughout the Scriptures, and if we look around our world, not only the atrocities that Jesus was predicting that was going to happen to Him, But in reality, the atrocities that were about to happen to Jesus were nothing new. And they're nothing to today. I've been really keen, this concept of how do we deal with what goes on in the world has been heavy on my heart, because I've been reading a couple of books and I saw a couple movies. I think one of them was called The Green Harvest. The Green Harvest. And after that, I got a book on what's called the Holodomor. The Holodomor is an instance of something that happened in Ukraine in 1933. So let me think. Some of you might have been alive at that time. Not all of you, some of you. 1933, Stalin intentionally, willfully put boundaries around the peasants in Ukraine to intentionally starve 5 million people to death. That was his whole goal. Don't let any food get in. Don't let any food get out. Starve them all to death. The reason I wanted you to post these for you is I wanted you to be aware we live such good lives, don't we? Currently, we're unmolested for the most part. We all live in peace. It's what we call, if there are any difficulties, it's because the ice cream got hard because we put it in the wrong part of the freezer. Those are difficulties, first world problems. But most of the world lives under oppression, tyranny, atrocities. And I thought, it would do a person good maybe to take a moment out of the good life that we live and be aware of the things that do happen around the world. I wanted to give you a list of a few that I'm very aware of. 1994. I was just getting back from college, the Rwandan genocide. I would write these down and look them up on YouTube and learn about how horrible, what kinds of depravity tyrants can put people through. The breakup of Yugoslavia, 1991. Atrocities happened there. The Nanjing Massacre, 1937. It would be worth looking at some of those. What was about to happen to Jesus was not something new, and it's been happening ever since. And it all boils down to, and I want this to hit home with you guys, the reason for this. If anybody ever says, why does a good God allow bad things to happen? The answer has got to be because men decided they wanted to get God out of their way. And when men decide, when tyrants decide, when kings decide, when presidents and emperors decide, I want to get God out of the way, God says, okay, go ahead, do it your way. And that is where the atrocities and the violence come from. So what can we do about them? What can we do in the face of atrocities? That's part 2 of our sermon. How can we triumph? And that brings us back to what Jesus is telling his disciples. Let's go down to verse 24. When they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax went up to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" And he said, "Yes." So 2 things in the text that kind of give us the sense of what we're looking at. First, when they came to Capernaum. Capernaum is in the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, and Capernaum is where Jesus and his apostles lived while they were in ministry to the area of Galilee. We know for certain that Peter had his house in Capernaum. We know Matthew, the tax collector, had his house in Capernaum. And so they're at somebody's house. This is where they lived. And then there was this 2 drachma tax. The 2 drachma tax was a tax that was collected once a year at the Passover. And it was a drachma tax to support the temple, the sacrifices and the work that was being done at the temple in Jerusalem. All the Jews had to pay it. So if you were local, you paid it right in your hometown. And that's what's happening here. They get to Capernaum. The tax collectors recognize them. They see them. They see they've been gone a long time. It's Passover. They're going to be heading down to Jerusalem pretty soon. And they say, hey, are you guys going to pay the temple tax? The temple tax was paid by men between the ages of 20 and 50. It was roughly 2 days' pay. And here's something that brings a little bit of light to our story. The temple tax did not have to be paid by rabbis. You don't collect the temple tax from a rabbi. And notice, they go up to Peter and they say, your teacher, you might want to put a square around that. Teacher, didasko, is the Greek word for teacher, but the Aramaic word for teacher would be rabbi. So here he is translated the Aramaic word rabbi into the Greek word didasko, teacher. Does your rabbi not pay the tax? Now, here's another strange thing about that sentence. Does he not pay the tax? That's a weird way to ask the question. So when something is phrased in the negative, it's kind of do I say taunting? A taunting way when you already know the answer is affirmative, when you know the answer is yes. Let me give you an example. We are going to eat a lot of food this Christmas holiday when we go to see my sister in Ellensburg. And she might at some point say to her older brother, which is me, Tony, do we not need to lose a couple pounds? Do you get it? Kind of a teasing, kind of a mocking, and the expected answer is, I know I need to lose a couple pounds. So when you phrase something in the negative, it's a taunting, belittling way to say, I know what the obvious answer is, but I'm pretending not to know so that I can put you in your place. And so these tax collectors were going up to Peter and they were mocking Jesus. Because a true rabbi does not pay the temple tax, but does your rabbi pay the temple tax? Peter says, yes, he does. We do pay the temple tax. Oh, so he's not a legitimate rabbi, is he? That's what's the undertone that's going on. Oh, your rabbi pays the tax, so maybe he's not legitimate after all. Degrading, discrediting the legitimacy of Jesus' ministry and of the disciples' ministry. You guys aren't really legitimate because our laws don't recognize you, do they? I've seen this happen. I've seen this happen even in our own day. There are some churches, the Catholic Church, the Baptist Church, some churches ordain their ministers. You have to go to school, you have to go before a board, and someone has to confer authority on you to say, okay, you are legitimate, you are recognized, you are studied, you have been appointed, you have been ordained by the organization as legitimate. Priests get that in the Catholic Church. The priest is the one that's legitimate. Nobody else has a say when it comes to the Bible because the priest is the one that's legitimate. He's the one that's ordained. Even in our own churches, if you see job openings, one of the things that you'll see in there is a master's degree or better in theology is required. See, if you don't have that master's degree or better, then you're not legitimate. You don't really have a place in the pulpit. That's what was going on here. So let's look at Jesus in this situation. He's opened himself up to be invalidated by the locals. He has opened himself up to going freely to Jerusalem where he will suffer. And he has opened himself up freely to let them kill him. What is the attitude? Jesus was facing atrocities, violence, murder. And what was his disposition in all of this? Let's go down to verse 25. After they had left that tax collector, when they came into the house, Jesus spoke to Peter, and he said, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others?" And when he said from others, Jesus said to him, "Then the sons are free." A lot going on in that text. A lot going on in that text. Then the sons are free. The first thing is Jesus is helping Peter recognize no matter what they just tried to do, the way they've just tried to humiliate us and our movement, the way they've just tried to humiliate your rabbi and your cause. Despite that, Peter, between us, we know what's going on. The sons are free. The sons don't have to worry about these kinds of titles. The sons don't have to worry about the world's approval. The sons don't have to clamor for the titles and the authority and the ordinations that the world clamors after. Because we're the sons of the King. When you're a son of the King, you don't need any other credentials. And so the first thing he says reminds Peter, we're free from all of this. There's another aspect of this in sort of saying we're the strangers in this world. The tax collectors, the governors, the kings, they don't recognize this, but we're really not part and parcel of this kingdom, of this system of the world. We're really not a part of that because we're the sons of the King. Another aspect of this is Jesus later on in Matthew will go in and turn the tables over in the temple. By the way, the money changers, the money changing that they were doing, they were collecting the 2 drachma tax when you go to Jerusalem. Jesus sees that and he turns over those tables and he decides enough is enough. But when he does that, he recognizes the temple is his Father's house. The temple was supposed to be my Father's house. The house of God is a house of prayer. And if the temple is the Father's house and Jesus is the Son of the Father, then should Jesus be paying the tax for the upkeep of the temple? Of course not. Jesus recognizes that. But he lets it go. Because the first thing he says is, and I'm saying this to you, church, in atrocities, first of all, remember whose you are. You are the sons. And the things that the world puts us through is because they don't recognize that, but they will recognize it one day. As far as being a son, let's look at this. Jesus also had something else. Matthew 17 and verse 5. He was still speaking. This is the transfiguration. When behold, a light, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, and I'm very pleased with him." Jesus didn't need the accolades of the people around him. Jesus didn't need the world to treat him appropriately and with respect, because Jesus knew whose son he was. Jesus knew where his value came from. Your value comes from your relationship with the God of heaven, not has anything to do with what's going on in this world. Where does your value come from? It comes from you being a son. Peter attested to Jesus being called God's son. 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 17. Peter says, we saw it. He received honor and glory from God. Not from men, but from God. The Father, when the voice came to him from the majestic glory saying, this is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased, we ourselves heard the voice from heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain. We heard it. We know it's true. And the sons don't pay the tax. Jesus shows humility. One of the commentaries here remarks on the miracle where Jesus says, go catch a fish, and the money for the tax is going to be in the fish's mouth. And this commentary talks about the miracle, the money in the fish's mouth. And he says, perhaps too, we are reminded of Jesus' humility. He who so controls nature and its powers that he can still storms and multiply food, now reminds Peter of the power by this miracle, while nevertheless remaining so humble that he would not needlessly cause an offense. The other aspect of Jesus in the face of atrocities, anger, rage, and violence is Jesus says we're going to compose ourselves in a way so as not to cause an offense. Not only does this apply to Jesus, but this applies to you as well. John chapter 1 and verse 11, he came to his own did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave them the right to become children of God. Children born not out of blood, nor the desire or the will of a man, but children that have been born of God. In the face of discrimination, in the face of prejudice, in the face of violence, remember whose you are. A son of God, a daughter of God, and the sons and the daughters ought not be paying tax here, but we do so as not to cause problems. There is a specialness about you. He goes on to say in Matthew 21, there are other people that think that they are the sons of God. You remember Jesus saying, don't tell me that you're Abraham's children and that makes you anything special, because I can raise up children for Abraham out of the stones. So your blood lineage, your ancestry has no bearing on whether or not you belong to God. Here it is, Matthew 21:43. Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to people who will produce fruit. The people are God, the people of God, the elect of God. God's holy Israel is not people that have a certain bloodline. God's holy Israel is people who will produce fruit. The people that produce the fruit of the kingdom, and that's part of what we're talking about today, producing fruit in the kingdom, even though, like Job, like John the Baptist, we want to walk in righteousness, but there are atrocities and there is violence and there is evil in the streets. And he says, just remember whose you are, and remember that we don't want to cause an offense in this world. We also reminded in the scripture that was the parable of the wheats and the tares. There's both good and bad growing in the kingdom right now. And one guy says, wouldn't it be a good idea to go get rid of all the tares? Let's go get rid of all the tares and the weeds. And he says, no, we're not going to do that yet. We do that at the end. So for now, weeds and fruitful plants have got to live at the same time. And so there are going to be problems. So what should our attitude be then if we have to live right alongside of the weeds? We'll come back to our text, verse 27. However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea, cast a hook in it, take the first fish that comes up. When you open its mouth, you'll find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and you. We've been called to follow Jesus' example of, even though Jesus knew and vocalized the children, the sons, don't have to pay this tax. He humbled himself. Humbled himself and said, don't give an offense, pay the tax. In another place, one day he'll say, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. That's what we do. Christians should not be causing problems in the world. Christians are called to live such righteous, upright lives that no one can accuse you of anything. We're told that we're supposed to copy Jesus in humility. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 6. Who existing in the very form of God did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he emptied himself. He took the form of a servant. He was made in human likeness, and even though he was found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and he became obedient to death. Do you remember the whole problem? The whole reason that there is anger and rage and violence and atrocious behavior happening in the world? Because people are saying, I want God out of my way. And the solution, he says here, is to be like Jesus and be obedient, right? The ones that want God out of the way are the disobedient. He says, be like Jesus, humble yourself, become a servant. Leave the camp of disobedience. Come over to Jesus' camp and be obedient even until death. Put God back in His rightful place in our lives, to where, as Jesus modeled for us, I only do what I see my Father doing. I only say what my Father tells me to say, and I say it exactly the way He says it. And I don't add to it, and I don't take away from it. I am obedient to it, even unto death. That is how we face the violence and the rage and the murder that we see in the world. And it's very real. We should pray and be thankful to God the Father. The Scripture says, be thankful that you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Be grateful that you haven't had to resist to that degree yet. Would you do that? Would you be grateful to God that we have not had to shed our blood yet? Boy, we should pray for that. We should exalt His holy name for having spared us the atrocities that other countries have gone through, the atrocious, evil dictator, tyrant. The Rwandan genocide. We've been spared that. We should exalt our God and thank Him for being spared all of those things. And yet, it's important that I drive home this sermon. I wanted to drive this home because in reality, if we ever turn into a third world country, if it ever comes to shedding blood, we're going to need this sermon. Put God back on the pedestal and be obedient to Him even unto death. We've got to reverse what happened in the garden. And Jesus gave us the example. He gives us the example here. I know I'm a son. I know that they have nothing over me, but in order to not cause an offense, let's go ahead and just play along.